26th Conference of the Parties, or COP26, which concluded recently in Glasgow, has revisited the Paris pledges of 2015. However, not without drama and controversy. While the phrase phase down instead of phase out in the final draft regarding the cutting down on coal emissions triggered a bad press for the developing countries, the leaders and experts in these nations, including those in India and Bangladesh, have outrightly called out the hypocrisy of developed nations, who they say have not obliged in assisting the former in order to meet the climate changes.
Coal, a fossil fuel that is responsible for 40% of CO2 emission globally, was discussed for the first time in the 26th session of Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. This was also the unprecedented conference where countries came together to pledge net zero emission, an initiative to cut down fossil fuel usage and move towards technology-driven clean energy in coming years. Major calls were also taken on deforestation, methane emission and financing of poor countries that cannot meet the commitments with resources they have. However, the questions that have been raised by several observers and experts from developing countries are more than just pertinent. While many say it was merely a PR exercise that might not materialize its aim of capping global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, others refer to it as a calibrated effort to prevent developing nations reaching where the developed have already reached. A New Delhi-based environmentalist, Vimlendu Jha, opines that India should have never signed the charter, for it will prevent it from growth.
It is important to address the issue of coal locally as well and globally. The last-minute drama indeed was about equity, how developing nations actually have a right to develop. As in, we cannot really sign up to net zero so immediately or make such huge climate commitments where there's right to grow or right to life, which is as paramount in a country like India, where there is the energy deficit. Per capita energy consumption of most Indians is very, very less.
Developing countries argue that rich nations whose historical emissions are largely responsible for warming the planet must finance their efforts both to transition away from fossil fuels and to adapt to increasingly severe climate impacts. The deal offered a promise to double adaptation finance by 2025 from 2019, but no guarantees have been given. Earlier, the developed countries had committed to finance the developing nations with $100 billion every year in order to make the efficient transition. They haven't delivered on that promise. A UN committee will report next year on progress towards the same, and the finance will then be discussed again in 2024 and 2026. Bangladesh has called the conference a massive failure, where countries like it were not given any solution and instead were burdened with fancy propositions.
We'll bring it up again. We're not giving up, but we are describing this COP as an abject failure because it hasn't been able to rise to the occasion of dealing with loss and damage. It doesn't matter what else they do. That was our issue. The poor countries, the vulnerable countries came here for that, and they've been slapped in the face by the presidents.
While COP26 was an opportunity where the pledges made under the Paris Climate Agreement could have been given a feasible blueprint for coming years, it has not been accepted on expected lines. The goal is to keep cutting emissions until they reach net zero by mid-century, but the developed countries that established themselves on the very same principles want other fastest-growing developing economies to be denied that privilege. A case study could be India, whose primary energy source is coal, but the per capita consumption is far below other countries. How can it be asked to control its emissions when the developed world has failed in meeting its commitments? Same goes for Bangladesh, one of the fastest growing economies after India. Leaders might have compulsions to fall in line with the international agendas, but the experts and people have clearly called the COP26 a failure, a massive failure. For now, just wait for the next year's COP27 summit in Egypt, where these objections might receive some traction and, more importantly, the action.